The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Harold Thompson's alarm clock rang at exactly 6 o'clock a.m. At 93 years old, the World War II veteran didn't need an alarm anymore. His body was used to this routine for the past 30 years. But Harold believed in discipline, something the Army had taught him long ago. He slowly sat up in his bed, his joints creaking like old floorboards. The small bedroom of his one-story house was neat and organized, with his medals and photographs from the war displayed proudly on the wall. Every morning, he would look at the black and white picture of his old Army unit and say a quiet prayer for those who never made it back home. Harold's morning routine was like clockwork. First, he would carefully make his bed with military precision, making sure each corner was tucked perfectly. Then, he would walk to his bathroom, using his wooden cane for support. The cane was a gift from his late wife Martha, who had passed away 5 years ago. It had her name carved into the handle, a constant reminder of their 60 years together. By 6:45 a.m., Harold was dressed in his usual outfit, pressed khaki pants, a light blue button-up shirt, and his favorite navy blue sweater vest. He always wore his World War II veteran's cap, which was slightly faded, but still showed the pride he felt for his service. The final touch was pinning on his Purple Heart medal, which he wore every day as a tribute to his fallen friends. At exactly 7 o'clock a.m., Harold would start his old Buick Century. The car was almost as old as some of his grandchildren, but he kept it in perfect condition. He would let it warm up for exactly 5 minutes, just like he had done every morning since buying it new in 1995. The car had been Martha's choice. She had loved its comfortable seats and smooth ride. The drive to Lucy's diner took exactly 12 minutes. Harold knew every turn, every stoplight, and every pothole on the way. He would always park in the same spot, the third space from the door, where the morning sun wouldn't make his car too hot for the drive home. The diner's neon sign would flicker to life just as he pulled in, almost as if it was waiting for him. Lucy's diner wasn't fancy. The red vinyl booths were worn in places, and the black and white checkerboard floor had lost some of its shine. But to Harold, it was perfect. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon would greet him as soon as he opened the door, a little bell above it announcing his arrival. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Sarah, the young waitress with kind eyes and a bright smile, would call out every morning. She was the granddaughter of the original Lucy, and she had been serving Harold his breakfast for the past 10 years. She knew his order by heart: 2 slices of wheat toast with strawberry jam, never grape, 2 eggs over it easy, and a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream. Harold would sit in his usual booth, the third one from the door, where he could see both the entrance and the street outside. Old habits from the war never really went away. Sarah would bring his coffee first, always making sure it was hot enough but not too hot. They would chat for a few minutes about her college classes or her young daughter, and Harold would share stories about when the diner first opened in 1952. The morning newspaper would be waiting for him, carefully folded just the way he liked it. Harold would spend exactly 1 hour reading every article, starting with the local news and ending with the sports section. He never read the obituaries anymore. Too many familiar names had started appearing there. Other regulars would wave to him as they came and went, and Harold would nod back with a gentle smile. Everyone in town knew him as Mr. Thompson, the veteran. He was a living piece of history, a reminder of a generation that was slowly fading away. This had been Harold's morning routine for decades, unchanging and reliable, like the ticking of a well-made clock. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as he pulled into his usual parking spot at Lucy's diner, he had no idea that his peaceful routine was about to be dramatically interrupted by the rumble of motorcycle engines and the arrival of visitors who would change his life forever. The peaceful morning atmosphere at Lucy's diner changed suddenly when 10 large motorcycles roared into the parking lot. Harold Thompson watched from his usual booth as the leather-clad riders took up several parking spaces with their bikes. The sound of their engines was so loud that his coffee cup rattled on the table. Sarah, the kind waitress, noticed Harold's worried expression. "They started coming here last week," she explained softly, refilling his coffee cup. "They show up every Tuesday morning now." Harold nodded silently, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup a bit tighter than usual. The bikers were a rough-looking group. Most of them had long beards, tattoos covering their arms, and wore black leather vests covered in patches. Their motorcycles were big, black machines that gleamed in the morning sun. Each time a car drove past, they would rev their engines, making a noise that reminded Harold of the tanks he had seen in the war. Harold tried to focus on his newspaper, but he couldn't help noticing how the bikers would stare at him through the diner's large windows. When he got up to leave that first Tuesday, they'd all turned to watch him walk to his car. His legs weren't as steady as they used to be, and using a cane made him feel vulnerable under their gaze. The next Tuesday was worse. As Harold tried to park in his usual spot, he found it blocked by 3 motorcycles. He had to park at the far end of the lot, making his walk to the diner longer and more difficult. The morning was cold, and his hip was bothering him more than usual. He could hear the bikers laughing as he slowly made his way to the entrance. Week after week, the situation got more uncomfortable. The bikers seemed to take special interest in Harold, though he couldn't understand why. They would rev their engines extra loud when he walked past, and sometimes they would park their bikes so close to his car that he had trouble getting in and out. Harold started to dread Tuesdays. One morning, he overheard 2 of them talking as he passed by. "Look at that cap he's wearing," one said to the other. "World War II, huh? Wonder if he was actually there or just bought it at some store." The words stung Harold deeply. He had served his country proudly, facing dangers these young men couldn't imagine. The other regular customers at Lucy's diner noticed the change in Harold. He was quieter now, less likely to share his usual friendly stories. Some stopped coming on Tuesdays altogether, not wanting to deal with the noisy bikers. Even Sarah seemed nervous when serving the large group, though they hadn't been rude to her. Harold considered changing his routine. He thought about finding another diner, or at least not coming on Tuesdays. But something in him refused to be chased away. This diner held too many memories. 30 years of mornings with his late wife Martha, celebrations with his children and grandchildren, countless conversations with friends who were now gone. One night, Harold sat in his living room, looking at his old military photographs. There he was, standing proud in his uniform, surrounded by his fellow soldiers. They had faced real danger together, fought real battles. Was he now going to let a group of bikers frighten him away from his favorite diner? The next Tuesday morning, Harold woke up even earlier than usual. He put on his best shirt, carefully pinned on his purple heart medal, and placed his veteran's cap firmly on his head. In the mirror, he saw not just an old man with a cane, but a soldier who had served his country with honor. As he drove to the diner, his heart was beating faster than normal. He knew the bikers would be there, but he had made up his mind. He wouldn't be intimidated. He had fought for his country's freedom, and that included the freedom to have breakfast at his favorite diner. When Harold pulled into the parking lot, he saw the bikers were already there, their motorcycles lined up like a wall of black metal. But today would be different. Today, as he parked his car and reached for his cane, he noticed something that would change everything. Something that would turn these seeming enemies into the most unlikely of friends. On this particular Tuesday morning, dark clouds hung low in the sky as Harold Thompson pulled into Lucy's diner's parking lot. His hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel, but he kept his chin up. As usual, the bikers' motorcycles filled most of the spaces, their chrome surfaces reflecting the gloomy morning light. Harold spotted a tight space between 2 motorcycles, barely wide enough for his Buick. As he carefully tried to maneuver his car into the spot, 3 large bikers suddenly stepped in front of his vehicle. Harold's foot immediately went to the brake pedal, his heart pounding in his chest like it hadn't done since his war days. The largest of the 3 bikers, a tall man with a gray beard and wearing a black leather vest, walked toward Harold's driver's side window. The man's face was weathered like old leather, and a long scar ran down his left cheek. The other 2 bikers flanked him, their arms crossed over their chests. Harold could see more bikers gathering behind them. Sarah, the waitress, watched nervously through the diner's window. She had already picked up the phone, ready to call the police if things got out of hand. Other customers inside the diner had stopped eating, all eyes focused on the scene unfolding in the parking lot. Harold's mind flashed back to his military training. Even at 93, he remembered what his sergeant had taught him about facing danger. Stay calm, assess the situation, and never show fear. His hands were trembling, but he kept them firmly on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions, just like he'd done while driving supply trucks through enemy territory in 1944. The lead biker stopped beside Harold's car and bent down, his face level with the window. Harold could smell leather and motorcycle exhaust. For a moment, neither man moved. The only sound was the idle rumble of motorcycles and the distant roll of thunder promising rain. Memories of combat flooded Harold's mind. The sounds of explosions, the smell of gunpowder, the faces of young men he'd served with. But he wasn't that young soldier anymore. He was a 93-year-old man with arthritis in his knees and a cane in his backseat. Still, something inside him refused to back down. With deliberate slowness, Harold pressed the button to lower his window. The electric motor whirred softly as the glass descended. He could feel his purple heart medal pinned to his chest, and it gave him courage. He had faced German tanks. He could face this. "Can I help you?" Harold asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. His words seemed to hang in the air between them. The biker leader's expression was unreadable behind his thick beard and dark sunglasses. The tension in the parking lot was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other bikers had formed a semicircle around Harold's car. Some had their hands in their pockets, others stood with arms crossed. The rain started to fall lightly, creating a soft patter on the car's roof. Inside the diner, Sarah had her finger hovering over the last one in 911. The cook had come out from the kitchen, still holding his spatula like a weapon. Even the morning traffic on the street had slowed down, drivers rubbernecking to see what was happening. Harold's thoughts turned to Martha, his late wife. What would she think if she could see him now? She had always told him he was too stubborn for his own good. Maybe she was right. Maybe he should have found another diner weeks ago, but it was too late for that now. The biker leader slowly raised his hands to his face. Harold tensed, unsure what to expect. But instead of making a threatening move, the man simply removed his sunglasses. His eyes were blue and sharp, and they focused on something in Harold's car that would change everything. Just as the tension reached its peak, just as Sarah was about to dial that final one, just as Harold was considering what he could use as a weapon if needed, the biker leader saw something that made him step back in surprise. His expression changed completely, and he quickly motioned for his fellow bikers to come closer. What happened next would not only change Harold's Tuesday mornings forever, but would also teach him an important lesson about judging people by their appearances. The rain was falling steadily now as Harold Thompson sat in his car, surrounded by the group of bikers. His heart was still racing, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The lead biker's face had transformed from threatening to surprised in an instant, and Harold couldn't understand why. Then he saw it. As the biker leader moved closer to the window again, a patch on his leather vest caught Harold's eye. The patch showed a screaming eagle against a dark background, the symbol of the 101st Airborne Division. Harold felt his breath catch in his throat. He had worn that same eagle on his uniform nearly 80 years ago during some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The memories hit him like a tidal wave. He remembered jumping out of airplanes over France, the sound of anti-aircraft fire filling the night sky. He remembered the cold winters during the Battle of the Bulge, where his unit had held the line against overwhelming odds. That screaming eagle had been their symbol of pride, their mark of brotherhood. Harold's eyes moved from one biker to another, and suddenly he noticed more military patches. Some wore Vietnam veteran patches, others showed service in Iraq and Afghanistan. These weren't just ordinary bikers, they were veterans, just like him. His hands stopped shaking on the steering wheel as understanding dawned. The leader of the bikers pointed at Harold's passenger seat, where his old military photo album lay. Harold had brought it today thinking he might need to prove his service if the bikers challenged him. The album was open to a yellowed photograph of young Harold standing proudly in his paratrooper uniform, the screaming eagle clearly visible on his shoulder. "Sir," the biker leader said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "are you a screaming eagle?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The other bikers had grown completely quiet, their earlier intimidating presence replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. Sarah watched from inside the diner, confused by the sudden change in the biker's behavior. She still held the phone in her hand, but her finger had moved away from the numbers. The other customers pressed their faces against the windows, trying to understand what was happening. With slightly shaking hands, Harold reached for the photo album. He opened his car door slowly, using his cane to steady himself as he stood. The bikers immediately stepped back, giving him space. Some of them even removed their caps in a show of respect. 101st Airborne Division, Harold said, his voice growing stronger. "I served from 1943 to 1945. He opened the album to show them photographs of his unit. The bikers gathered around, careful to keep their distance but eager to see the historical images. Their faces showed genuine interest and respect. The biker leader gently touched the photograph of young Harold. "My father served in Vietnam with the 101st, he said softly. He always told me stories about the World War II paratroopers who came before him. Said they were the bravest men he'd ever heard of." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. Other bikers began sharing their own connections to the unit. One had served in Desert Storm, another in Afghanistan. Each had their own story, their own reason for wearing the Screaming Eagle. Harold listened, amazed at how this symbol had connected generations of soldiers across different wars. The rain had stopped now, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. It gleamed off the wet motorcycles and created a kind of glow around the group of men, old and young veterans, standing together in a parking lot, united by a simple patch and shared experiences of service. Inside the diner, Sarah finally put down the phone. She watched through the window as these supposedly scary bikers treated the elderly veteran with what could only be described as profound respect. She saw smiles replacing scowls and gentle hands reaching out to steady Harold when he swayed slightly. What had started as a confrontation was turning into something entirely different. The patch on the biker's vest had done more than just identify him as a fellow soldier. It had opened a door between generations of veterans, a door that would lead to an unexpected friendship and understanding. But this was just the beginning. As Harold would soon discover, these bikers had been watching him for weeks for a very specific reason, and their true intentions would surprise him even more than their military connection. The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, drying the rain from the parking lot of Lucy's diner. Harold Thompson stood surrounded by the bikers, his photo album open in his trembling hands. The leader of the group, who had introduced himself as Mike Johnson, was carefully turning the pages of Harold's old military photographs. "Mr. Thompson," Mike said, his voice filled with respect, "we've been trying to figure out how to approach you for weeks." He pointed to a small American flag pin on Harold's collar. "We noticed your veteran's license plate and your pins, but we weren't sure how to start a conversation." Harold looked confused. "You mean, all this time, you weren't trying to intimidate me?" He leaned on his cane, trying to understand. Sarah, the waitress, had come outside now, bringing Harold's regular coffee in a to-go cup. She stood nearby, listening with growing amazement. Mike's weathered face broke into an embarrassed smile. "Those engine revs weren't meant to scare you, sir. It's how we salute. It's a biker thing, showing respect." He looked at his fellow riders, who nodded in agreement. "We've been parking close to your car to keep an eye on you. Make sure you got in and out safely." One by one, the bikers began introducing themselves. There was Tom, who had served in Desert Storm, and Johnny, who had done 3 tours in Afghanistan. Each had a story, each had worn the uniform, and each had been watching over Harold in their own way. "But why didn't you just come talk to me?" Harold asked, accepting the coffee from Sarah with a thankful nod. His hands had stopped shaking now, and his voice was stronger. A younger biker named Steve stepped forward. "Honestly, sir, we were a bit intimidated ourselves." The others chuckled, but nodded in agreement. "You're a World War II veteran. You jumped into Normandy, fought in the Battle of the Bulge. You're living history." Mike reached into his leather vest and pulled out an old, creased photograph. It showed a young soldier in Vietnam, wearing the same Screaming Eagle patch. "This was my father," he explained. "He told me stories about the World War II paratroopers. Said they were the toughest soldiers he'd ever heard of. And here you are, one of the original Screaming Eagles, coming to the same diner we do." Harold's eyes misted over as he looked at the photograph. "Your father was a brave man," he said softly. "They all were. Every generation of soldiers, fighting for what they believe in." The other customers in the diner had gathered at the windows, watching the scene unfold. What they saw wasn't a group of intimidating bikers surrounding an elderly man anymore. They saw veterans of different ages and different wars, sharing a moment of understanding and respect. Sarah brought out more coffee for everyone, and the group moved to the tables outside the diner. Harold sat in the middle, his photo album open on the table. The bikers gathered around, listening intently as he pointed to different photographs, sharing stories they had only read about in history books. "This was my unit before D-Day," Harold explained, pointing to a black and white photograph. "Half of these men never made it home." The bikers listened in respectful silence, understanding the weight of his words in a way that only other soldiers could. Mike placed his hand gently on Harold's shoulder. "Mr. Thompson, our motorcycle club is made up entirely of veterans. We meet here every Tuesday morning before our weekly ride." He paused, looking at his fellow riders who were all nodding encouragingly. "We'd be honored if you join us for breakfast every Tuesday. Make it a regular thing." Harold looked around at the faces of these men who had seemed so threatening just an hour ago but now felt like brothers. He saw in their eyes the same thing he saw in his old war photographs: courage, loyalty, and understanding. Sarah watched from the diner's doorway, smiling as she saw Harold's face light up with joy. The scary bikers who had disrupted her quiet morning shifts had turned out to be guardian angels in leather vests. But this was just the beginning. What started as a simple invitation to breakfast would soon turn into something much bigger, something that would change not only Harold's life, but the lives of veterans throughout their small town. The next few Tuesdays brought big changes to Lucy's diner. Harold Thompson no longer sat alone in his usual booth. Instead, he found himself at the center of a large table, surrounded by his new friends from the Veterans Motorcycle Club. The other customers had gotten used to the unusual sight: an elderly man in a wool sweater vest, sitting among a group of leather-clad bikers, all of them hanging on his every word. Mike, the club leader, had given Harold a special vest of his own. It wasn't leather like the others, but a comfortable blue denim that Martha would have approved of. On the back was the club's patch, and under it, specially made for Harold, were the words "Original Screaming Eagle, World War II Veteran." Harold wore it proudly every Tuesday. "Tell us again about D-Day, Steve," the youngest member would ask. He always sat closest to Harold, his notebook ready. Harold noticed how Steve wrote down every detail, treating each story like a precious piece of history. The young veteran had served in Afghanistan, but he said Harold's stories helped him understand the long line of soldiers he was part of. Sarah, the waitress, had changed too. She no longer worried when she saw the motorcycles pull up. Instead, she had their coffee ready and waiting. She learned how each of them liked their eggs, and she'd added a new item to the menu called the Veterans Special: Harold's usual breakfast of wheat toast, 2 eggs over easy, and black coffee. One morning, Tom, who had served in Desert Storm, brought his teenage son to meet Harold. The boy was working on a school history project about World War II. Harold spent 2 hours showing him old photographs and explaining what it was really like to be a young soldier. The boy's eyes grew wide when Harold described jumping from planes in the dark over enemy territory. "Were you scared?" the boy asked. Harold looked around at his fellow veterans before answering. "We were all scared," he said honestly. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done anyway." The other veterans nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The bikers had their own stories too. Johnny talked about the hot desert nights in Iraq, and Mike shared memories of his father's stories from Vietnam. They discovered that while wars had changed, soldiers hadn't. They still looked out for each other, still carried the same hopes and fears, still fought for the same things. Every Tuesday, before leaving the diner, the bikers would help Harold to his car. But now it wasn't because they thought he needed help. It was because they enjoyed every extra minute of his company. They had learned that Harold's stories weren't just about battles and missions. He told them about coming home, about building a life after the war, about loving Martha for 60 years, about raising children and grandchildren. "You're teaching us more than just war stories," Mike told him one morning. "You're teaching us how to live after the uniform comes off." The other veterans murmured in agreement. Many of them had struggled with returning to civilian life, but Harold's examples gave them hope and guidance. Word spread about their Tuesday meetings. Other veterans from town started showing up at the diner. Some were old like Harold, while others were young men and women just back from recent conflicts. The big table got more crowded every week, but there was always room for one more. Harold's grandson visited one Tuesday and couldn't believe his eyes. His quiet, reserved grandfather was holding court like a king, surrounded by attentive listeners. The old veteran who used to sit alone was now the heart of a growing community. The bikers had their own way of showing respect. When Harold arrived each Tuesday, they would rev their engines in unison, no longer a sound that scared him, but a roaring salute that made him stand taller. They escorted his car into the parking lot like an honor guard, making sure he got his usual spot near the door. But the brotherhood they had formed was about to face its first real test. None of them knew it yet, but an unexpected event would soon show just how strong their bond had become, and how a group of bikers and one elderly veteran would change their entire community. One cold Tuesday morning in October, Harold Thompson didn't show up at Lucy's diner. For the first time in 30 years, his usual spot remained empty. The bikers waited for an hour, growing increasingly worried. Sarah, the waitress, hadn't received her usual cheerful morning greeting, and Harold's coffee cup sat unused on the counter. Mike immediately organized the group. "Something's wrong," he said, pulling out his phone to call Harold's home number, which he had saved weeks ago. No answer. Steve and Johnny quickly got on their bikes to ride to Harold's house, while the others stayed at the diner in case he showed up late. When Steve and Johnny arrived at Harold's small house, they found his newspaper still on the front porch, something very unusual for the disciplined veteran. Through the window, they could see Harold sitting in his armchair, looking pale and weak. He was conscious but clearly in distress. They called an ambulance immediately. As the paramedics arrived, so did the rest of the motorcycle club, their engines announcing their presence like a cavalry charge. The neighbors came out to watch as these tough-looking bikers gently helped the paramedics get Harold safely into the ambulance. "It's my heart," Harold told them weakly. "Been giving me trouble lately. Didn't want to worry anyone." Mike climbed into the ambulance with Harold, while the others formed a motorcycle escort, their bikes surrounding the ambulance like a protective shield as it made its way to the hospital. At the hospital, the doctors found that Harold had suffered a mild heart attack. He would need to stay for observation and possibly undergo some tests. The hospital staff was surprised to find their waiting room filled with leather-clad bikers, all anxiously waiting for news about their elderly friend. Sarah from the diner arrived with fresh coffee and sandwiches for everyone. She had closed the diner early to be there, knowing that her Tuesday regulars wouldn't be coming back that day. "Family takes care of family," she said simply, handing out the food. The bikers organized themselves into shifts, making sure Harold was never alone. They discovered he had no immediate family nearby. His children lived in different states and couldn't arrive for a few days. So the motorcycle club became his temporary family. Tom brought Harold's photo album from his house, knowing it would cheer him up. Steve set up a small TV in the hospital room and found a channel playing old war movies, which they watched together. Johnny, who worked as a handyman, went to Harold's house every day to check on things and take care of his yard. Other veterans who had become regulars at their Tuesday meetings started visiting too. The hospital room became a gathering place for soldiers of all ages. They shared stories, laughed together, and made sure Harold's spirits stayed high. One evening, as Mike sat with Harold, the old veteran became serious. "You know," Harold said quietly, "after Martha passed away, I was just existing, not really living. These past few months with all of you, you've given me something to look forward to again." Mike squeezed Harold's hand gently. "You gave us something too," he replied. "You showed us that being a veteran isn't just about the wars we fought. It's about the life we live afterward." The doctors were amazed at Harold's quick recovery. They said the support system around him was better medicine than anything they could prescribe. Within a week, Harold was strong enough to go home, but the bikers weren't done taking care of him. They organized a schedule to check on him daily. Someone would bring him breakfast every morning, and they made sure he took his medications on time. The motorcycle club members used their various skills to help. One fixed Harold's leaky roof, another repaired his old car, and another installed safety rails in his bathroom. Sarah worked with the diner's owner to arrange for daily meal deliveries to Harold's house. The other regular customers contributed too, sending books, magazines, and cards. What had started as a simple Tuesday breakfast group had grown into a community of people looking out for each other. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. The bikers had been working on a secret project, something that would not only help Harold but would change the lives of many other veterans in their town. They were about to turn their Tuesday meetings into something much bigger than anyone had imagined. 3 months after Harold's heart attack, Lucy's diner looked very different on Tuesday mornings. What had started as a small group of bikers and one World War II veteran had grown into something extraordinary. The parking lot was now filled with not just motorcycles, but cars of all types, bringing veterans from across the county to what had become known as Veterans Morning. Harold sat in his usual spot, now feeling stronger than ever. His blue denim vest had a new patch on it that read, Honorary President, Veterans Brotherhood. The motorcycle club had surprised him with this title the day he returned to the diner after his recovery. But the real surprise was what they had accomplished during his absence. Mike stood up one morning and made a special announcement. Thanks to Harold's inspiration, he said, his voice carrying across the crowded diner, we've officially registered as a veterans support organization. The Veterans Brotherhood is now a real nonprofit group, helping soldiers of all ages connect and support each other. The bikers had used their various skills and connections to create something meaningful. Tom, who worked at a local college, had arranged for younger veterans to get educational counseling. Johnny had started a home repair program, teaching job skills to veterans while helping elderly ones maintain their houses. Steve had created a website where veterans could share their stories and find resources. Sarah had convinced the diner's owner to offer free coffee to any veteran who came in on Tuesday mornings. The owner, moved by how the community had come together, had gone even further. He'd added a wall of honor where veterans could hang their photographs. Harold's World War II picture held the center spot. One Tuesday, Harold arrived to find a television news crew setting up in the diner. The local station had heard about their group and wanted to do a story. Harold watched with pride as Mike explained how a misunderstanding between an elderly veteran and a motorcycle club had turned into a movement that was changing lives. We thought we were just getting breakfast, Mike told the reporter, but we found a brotherhood instead. The camera panned across the diner, showing veterans of all ages talking, laughing, and supporting each other. Some wore leather jackets, others wore business suits, and some came in their work clothes, but all were welcome. The story caught the attention of veteran organizations across the state. Soon, other towns started their own versions of Veterans Mourning. Harold received letters from people who had seen the news story, including some of his old war buddies who still kept in touch. They'd all said the same thing. What was happening at Lucy's diner was special. Harold's children, who had worried about their father living alone, were amazed by the change in him. His daughter Jane visited one Tuesday and cried when she saw how the other veterans treated him with such respect and affection. Dad, she said, Mom would have loved this. Harold knew she was right. Martha had always believed in the power of bringing people together. The biggest moment came when the mayor visited the diner to present Harold and the motorcycle club with a special citation. You've shown us, the mayor said, that it's never too late to build bridges between generations, and that sometimes the strongest families are the ones we create ourselves. As Harold looked around the crowded diner that morning, he saw much more than just a group of veterans having breakfast. He saw young soldiers finding mentors, older veterans finding purpose, and everyone finding friendship. The scary-looking bikers who had once made him nervous were now his closest friends, his chosen family. Steve had started recording Harold's stories, preserving them for future generations. Your experiences shouldn't be lost, he told Harold. They're part of our heritage as soldiers. Other older veterans began sharing their stories too, creating a living history that connected past and present. On Harold's 94th birthday, the diner was packed. Veterans from across the state came to celebrate. The bikers presented him with a special gift, a custom-made walking cane with the Screaming Eagle emblem carved into its handle. But the real gift was looking around and seeing how one small misunderstanding had grown into something that touched so many lives. You know what the best part is? Harold told Mike that day. Every Tuesday morning, I wake up knowing I'm not just going to breakfast, I'm going home to family. The roar of motorcycles outside seemed to agree, their engines singing a song of brotherhood that would continue long into the future.